Hey there, Drowsy Historian here. Tonight we're not visiting a battlefield or a crumbling palace. Instead, we're widening the view to the entire planet and watching it try over and over to erase nearly everything that crawled, swam, or breathed upon it. Before we sift through these quiet disasters, do me one small favour. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. If you'd prefer these stories without ads, you can join the Patreon. It's linked in the description. And if you want the ultimate immersive experience, consider using a pair of wireless earbuds. They're comfortable, discreet, and designed so you can wear them even while sleeping. I've linked my favourite pair, plus other sleep tools, in the description. Now, lie back, get comfortable. Let's begin. Extinction is often spoken of as a tragedy, a cruel interruption of what should have been a long, stable story. In reality, it is the story. For every living thing that thrives in the present, there are countless more that existed briefly, disappeared, and left no descendants. If one were to measure the history of life, not by its triumphs but by its failures, the ledger would be overflowing. Roughly 99% of all species that have ever lived are no longer here, their existence compressed into the rock record as little more than chemical traces, fossil fragments, and the occasional impression in mud. To survive is not the rule, but the anomaly. Life persists for a while, lingers longer than seems plausible, and then yields to the inevitable. It is tempting to see ourselves as separate from this cycle, standing upright, clever, and conscious, capable of bending nature to our needs. Yet this belief in permanence is a luxury of short memory. The age of humans is a blink in geological terms, a thin line drawn on an unimaginably long timeline, precarious and fragile. For almost all of Earth's history, the creatures who dominated were not mammals, and certainly not people, but forms that would now look alien, trilobites with their armoured plates, towering ferns, reptilian titans, ammonites coiled like clockwork. They too would have believed themselves enduring if they had the capacity for belief. They too vanished. The story of life, when pulled back to its full length, is one punctuated by resets. These are not the ordinary extinctions that occur daily. A bird eaten, a plant uprooted, a predator starved. These are the events that stretch across continents and oceans, stripping away most of what exists. Scientists have marked out 5 such catastrophes, calling them the Big 5 mass extinctions. Each was different in cause, but all were similar in consequence. The majority of species alive at the time were abruptly removed, ecosystems collapsed, and the survivors, often few, often small, often lucky, became the unlikely architects of whatever world emerged afterward. The idea of the Big 5 is both comforting and misleading. Comforting because it implies we can count them, organise them, make them finite. Misleading because the planet has experienced countless smaller disasters, regional collapses, and near misses that never make the headline list. But the Big 5 stand out because they reached across nearly every environment and erased so much of the familiar that the world afterward was scarcely recognisable. They are bookmarks in the evolutionary record, dividing eras, rewriting rules, and determining who would inherit the Earth next. And so, we will walk through these 5 dark chapters, not to sensationalise them, but to see them as they were, moments when Earth nearly pressed reset on the whole experiment of life. Each one wiped the slate nearly clean, and each one left the survivors to rebuild in strange and unexpected ways. The first calamity struck when life was still mostly confined to the seas, and when a sudden chill was enough to tip the balance. When we rewind to the Ordovician period, roughly 485 to 444 million years ago, the world looks nothing like the one we know. Continents drift in unfamiliar shapes, clustered largely in the southern hemisphere, while vast, shallow seas spread across low-lying land masses. These seas are the stage upon which most life still plays its part. There are no forests, no grasses, no buzzing insects. The land is barren and windswept, rocky plains with microbial mats and the earliest non-vascular plants clinging to damp surfaces. But below the waves, existence flourishes. Trilobites scuttle across the seafloor in armour-plated hordes. Brachiopods anchor themselves like tiny shells with valves. Corals build primitive reef systems, and strange jawless fish, little more than armoured tubes with mouths, filter the water for food. It is not a silent world either. The ocean is teeming, if not with sound, then with the quiet thrum of survival. The Ordovician is a golden age for marine biodiversity. Evolution experiments freely, producing ornate shells, bizarre body plans, and delicate reef communities. If you could walk along the shore and peer into tidal pools, you would see alien beauty in miniature, crinoids waving feather-like arms to snatch food, nautiloid cephalopods with long conical shells patrolling the waters, and colonies of bryozoans weaving lace-like mats across stones. These organisms, though primitive to us, are the cutting edge of life in their time. Diversity is high, ecosystems complex, and niches filled. It is, in its way, a stable and balanced world, at least until the balance begins to tip. The trigger comes not from some obvious catastrophe, no asteroid or apocalyptic eruption, but from a slow rearrangement of continents and atmosphere. Land masses drifted toward the South Pole, assembling into a supercontinent called Gondwana. As they did, global climate patterns shifted. Ice sheets began to expand at the poles, and in a world that had grown comfortable under greenhouse conditions, the sudden chill was unwelcome. Temperatures dropped, ice accumulated, and sea levels began to fall. To life in the shallow seas, this was nothing short of disastrous. The habitats that had fostered reefs and nurseries were drowned not by water, but by absence. Where once there had been warm, sunlit shelves, there was now air, cold rock, and advancing ice. The fall in sea level was catastrophic. Shallow marine habitats, which held much of the planet's biodiversity, vanished almost overnight in geological terms. Imagine entire coastal plains and reef systems desiccating, their coral skeletons bleaching, their trilobite inhabitants stranded. Populations shrank and ecosystems contracted, for organisms adapted to narrow bands of depth, light and salinity. Relocation was not an option. Extinction spread not by violence, but by slow suffocation. Brachiopods clung uselessly to stones now left above the tide line, their delicate feeding structures withering in dry air. Crinoids found themselves toppled, their stalks exposed to the elements. Trilobites tried to follow the retreating shoreline, but they were no more capable of outrunning continental ice sheets than a crab would be of outrunning a glacier today. As ice expanded, temperatures plunged. The Ordovician seas, once relatively warm, grew cold and oxygen poor. Life in the tropics fared no better than life at the poles. Currents shifted, nutrient patterns collapsed, and the ecological networks that had supported diverse marine communities began to unravel. Entire orders of trilobites vanished, not because they were outcompeted, but because their environment disappeared. Corals, which rely on precise balances of temperature and chemistry, declined dramatically. Plankton populations, which underpinned the food web, plummeted. It was as if someone had quietly unstitched the very fabric of marine life, leaving nothing but loose threads drifting in the current. For a moment, though, there was still hope. Evolution is opportunistic, and some lineages adapted to cooler waters or deeper environments, but the respite was brief. After several million years of deep freeze, the pendulum swung violently the other way. Ice sheets melted with equal suddenness, sea levels surged, and drowned the habitats that had managed to stabilise. What little had survived the freeze now faced the flood. Warmth returned, but it was suffocating rather than liberating. Oxygen levels in the oceans collapsed as circulation faltered. Stagnant waters bred anoxia, a deadly condition in which life simply cannot breathe. Organisms drowned, not for lack of water, but for lack of anything in that water to sustain them. This double punch, first ice, then flood, proved devastating. Estimates suggest that about 85% of marine species disappeared in the span of a few million years. In human terms, that is incomprehensibly slow, but in geological terms, it is brutally abrupt. Communities that had flourished for tens of millions of years were wiped clean. Reef systems collapsed entirely, a preview of collapses they would suffer again in later eras. Whole families of trilobites disappeared. Bryozoans, which had spread in lace-like colonies, nearly vanished. Graptolites, once diverse and widespread, were reduced to a shadow of their former abundance. It was as though the ocean had been reset to a simpler state, stripped of its complexity. The world did not end, but it narrowed. Survivors crept into whatever niches remained. Deeper waters, scattered pockets of stable chemistry, marginal habitats where conditions were less extreme. Some lineages of trilobites staggered on. Their ranks thinned, their diversity curtailed. Nautiloid cephalopods, adaptable and opportunistic, weathered the storm. Jawless fish, primitive as they were, also endured. But the richness of the Ordovician seas was gone. What had been a flourishing experiment in complexity was reduced to something spare, tentative, and fragile. It would take millions of years before biodiversity rebounded, and even then the world was forever changed. While we tend to focus on the drama of later extinctions, the fire of the Permian, the asteroid of the Cretaceous, this first great die-off was quieter, more subtle, and perhaps all the more unsettling for it. It showed that catastrophe need not arrive as an explosion from the sky. It can come instead from the gradual rearrangement of continents, the slow accumulation of ice, and the delicate chemistry of the sea, tipping just a fraction too far. In the Ordovician, there was no villain to blame, no singular culprit. There was only the planet's indifference, expressed in temperature curves and sea levels. For the trilobites who had scuttled confidently across the sea floor for tens of millions of years, this was perhaps the first taste of a crueler truth. Survival is never guaranteed. Some clung on and would stagger into later periods, but many more ended their story here. If you were a trilobite, this was a very bad day. In the end, the Ordovician Silurian extinction was a rehearsal of sorts, the first great demonstration of the fragility of complex ecosystems. The seas eventually rebounded from the devastation of the Ordovician Silurian disaster. Corals once again spread across shallow shelves, trilobites staged a partial recovery, and jawless fish re-established themselves in coastal waters. But the world that followed was not the same as the one that came before. Evolution does not rewind. It writes new drafts on the ruins of the old. By the time the Devonian period arrived, roughly 419 million years ago, the oceans had entered what paleontologists call the Age of Fish. This was a time when vertebrates began to rise from minor players to dominant forms, when reefs reached their greatest expanses in Earth's history, and when the first forests began to take hold on land. It was an age of experimentation, of novelty, and, as with all ages of flourishing, an age already heading toward collapse. If you could have snorkeled in a Devonian sea, the first impression would have been of scale and variety. Armoured placoderms, great-jawed fish clad in bony plates, patrolled the shallows. Some grew longer than buses, their jaws hinged with crushing force, capable of biting through shell and armour alike, smaller fish darted between reefs, some developing primitive lungs to gulp air at the surface. Sharks, newcomers on the evolutionary scene, sliced through the water with speed, though they were clumsier than their modern descendants. Trilobites, those tireless survivors, still crept along the seabed, though their glory days were behind them. Corals built reefs of unprecedented size, sprawling thousands of kilometres and rivaling any modern equivalent. The Devonian oceans, rich in form and function, were a vision of abundance. Life was also gaining a toehold on land. In earlier ages, the continents had been barren plains, with perhaps a smear of moss or a microbial crust. Now plants began to push upward. The first true forests emerged, with tall, primitive trees lacking leaves, as we know them but stretching toward the sky in dense stands. These forests transformed the continents, shading the soil, changing wind patterns, and building complex root systems. Insects, still small and primitive, skittered through undergrowth. Amphibious vertebrates crawled from water to land, their limbs sturdy enough to support them in short bursts outside the shallows. It was, for the first time, a world with green landscapes and creeping animals exploring the margins. But abundance comes with consequences. The expansion of plants, in particular, altered the very chemistry of the planet. Plants absorb carbon dioxide during photosynthesis, exhaling oxygen as waste. In moderation, this is useful, indeed essential for the breathable atmosphere humans enjoy today. But in the Devonian, the sudden explosion of forests pulled so much carbon dioxide from the air that it destabilized global climate. Oxygen levels spiked, while carbon levels crashed. Greenhouse warming gave way to sudden cooling. Climate swung back and forth, at times erratic, at times extreme. Seas rose and fell, temperatures shifted, and life found itself trapped in oscillations it could not easily escape. The consequences were most severe in the oceans, where ecosystems were already finely tuned to chemistry and climate. Rivers flowing through forests carried with them vast amounts of organic material and nutrients. When these poured into the seas, they fertilized algal blooms of staggering proportions. At first, these blooms may have seemed like bounty, a sudden feast of plankton and microbial life. But as the algae died and decomposed, they consumed oxygen, leaving the water stagnant and suffocating. Anoxia spread across entire seas, creating vast dead zones where little could survive. Coral reefs, which depend on clean oxygenated water, collapsed. Fish suffocated in their own nurseries. Trilobites, already diminished, suffered further losses. The extinction did not come in one dramatic event, but in pulses stretched across millions of years. Between 375 and 359 million years ago, waves of collapse rolled across ecosystems. Each wave erased lineages, destabilized survivors, and left ecosystems weakened for the next. Some paleontologists suggest as many as 10 separate extinction pulses struck during this span, each cutting down another fraction of life. Unlike the single, catastrophic strike of an asteroid, the Late Devonian extinction was death by repetition, like the ocean being drained one basin at a time until nearly everything was gone. The numbers are grim. Roughly 75% of all species disappeared. Reef ecosystems, which had flourished for over 100 million years, collapsed entirely and did not return to their former scale until tens of millions of years later in the Mesozoic. Entire families of armoured placoderms vanished. Their age of dominance snuffed out. Trilobites lost still more lineages, reduced to a fraction of their earlier diversity. Brachiopods, corals, crinoids, and ammonoids all suffered catastrophic losses. Fish survived. After all, This was the age of fish, but they were thinned and altered. By the time the Devonian closed, ecosystems were simpler, less extravagant, and less resilient. The paradox of the Devonian extinction is that its ultimate culprit may have been the very plants that later allowed humans to exist. Forests drew down carbon dioxide so effectively that they triggered climate instability, cooled the planet, and fertilized seas into suffocation. They also helped bury carbon in sediments, permanently altering Earth's atmosphere toward higher oxygen. This was a gift to future land animals, who would evolve in a world where breathing became easier. But it was a curse to the contemporaries, who drowned in seas turned toxic by runoff and oxygen starvation. In other words, the forests gave us the air we need, but nearly killed everything else first. Recovery was slow and uneven. With reefs gone, marine ecosystems lost their most complex habitats, and biodiversity remained low for tens of millions of years. Placoderms, once rulers of the seas, never returned. Their disappearance cleared the stage for sharks and ray-finned fish to rise in later ages, but at the time, it left a gaping ecological void. On land, forests continued to expand, though they too faced setbacks as climate swung. The amphibians creeping onto shore found themselves vulnerable to shifting habitats, their tenuous foothold tested by cycles of flood and drought. In the long run, the Devonian extinction cleared space for new lineages, but at the cost of eliminating much of what had defined the age. For humans today, forests are saviours, pulling carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and offering breathable oxygen. For Devonian life, however, the forests were saboteurs, rewriting the rules of chemistry too quickly for the oceans to cope. By the close of the Devonian, life had been battered but not erased. The Carboniferous period that followed became a strange kind of renaissance, one where swamps stretched across continents, and trees, ferns and seed-bearing plants dominated landscapes once barren. Oxygen levels soared higher than at almost any other time in Earth's history, reaching concentrations of more than 30% of the atmosphere. The air itself would have smelled thick and almost metallic, rich with oxygen but laden with damp decay from endless wetlands. In this lush, swampy world, insects thrived beyond imagination. Dragonflies with wingspans the length of hawks drifted through the air, and millipedes as long as a person and wider than your forearm crept across forest floors. It was a green, humid, alien planet, and yet one in which life felt secure, fattened on abundance. By the time the Permian period dawned, some 299 million years ago, ecosystems had diversified even further. The amphibians that once dominated the Carboniferous swamps began to give way to reptiles, whose shelled eggs freed them from the tyranny of water. These reptiles radiated into new forms, squat, pig-like dicynodonts with tusked faces, sprawl-limbed parasaurs lumbering around, and nimble, sharp-toothed gorgonopsids, the apex predators of their time. The Permian was a landscape of experimentation, with evolutionary oddities on every continent. The air remained heavy with oxygen, forests spread wide, and the seas teemed with brachiopods, crinoids, ammonoids, and fish. Trilobites, veterans of nearly 300 million years, still persisted, though their diversity was fading. To anyone alive then, a gorgonopsid prowling a fern forest, or a trilobite creeping across a reef, the world must have felt eternal. Yet permanence is a dangerous illusion. The continents, though they looked stable to the creatures inhabiting them, were sliding together. The great supercontinent Pangaea was assembling, stretching nearly pole to pole. Its vast interior was dry and seasonal, with searing summers and freezing winters far from any moderating sea. Deserts spread across central Pangaea, dotted with hardy vegetation. This brought new evolutionary pressures. reptiles with their watertight scales fared better than moisture-hungry amphibians. Life was adjusting, diversifying, filling niches across land and sea, and then Siberia cracked open. Around 252 million years ago, the crust split in great fissures, and lava began to pour out. This was not the dramatic cone-shaped volcano familiar to us, but something on a continental scale. The eruptions that followed dwarfed any modern comparison. Lava sheets spilled across Siberia for hundreds of thousands of years, then millions, covering more than 5 million square kilometres, an area large enough to bury Western Europe. The ground itself became rivers of molten basalt, but it was not the lava alone that doomed life. It was the gases. This was the beginning of what scientists now call the Great Dying, the most severe extinction event in Earth's history, when the planet came closer than ever before to sterilizing itself entirely. Carbon dioxide gushed into the atmosphere in unimaginable volumes. Temperatures began to climb. Methane, trapped in frozen hydrates beneath the oceans and in permafrost soils, destabilized as the planet warmed, releasing even more potent greenhouse gases. The effect compounded itself. Warming released methane, which triggered more warming, in a feedback loop spiraling out of control. Meanwhile, sulfur dioxide clouds seeded acid rain that stripped leaves from trees, burned the skin of amphibians, and poisoned freshwater streams. Ash blotted the sky, muting photosynthesis. To live under this sky would have been to endure air at once choking, sour, and faintly toxic, a climate turning hostile with each breath. The oceans bore the worst of it. Warmed from above, they lost their natural circulation. Stagnant waters bred anoxia, starving marine organisms of oxygen. Hydrogen sulfide began to accumulate, a foul, poisonous gas exhaled by certain bacteria that flourish in oxygen-depleted waters. In deep basins, the water turned green, then purple, then black. Dead zones spread across continental shelves. Coral reefs, already fragile, dissolved as seawater acidified under the weight of carbon. Shells thinned, calcified skeletons crumbled, plankton collapsed. The very foundation of the food web was erased, and everything that depended on it, from trilobites to fish to predators, followed in cascade. On land, the collapse came in flames. Forests died under the assault of acid rain and firestorms. Vegetation withered in heat waves, and barren landscapes spread where lush ecosystems had stood. Insects, which had survived every prior extinction, finally faltered. Entire orders of insects vanished, the only time in Earth's history they were so heavily affected. Amphibians, tied to water for reproduction, dwindled in number and diversity. Even the mighty gorgonopsids, once the top predators of the Permian, disappeared. The air itself, saturated with carbon dioxide, became nearly unbreathable for large animals. As the atmosphere warmed and dried, the interiors of Pangaea turned into wastelands of dust and rock. The collapse was not a single day or even a single century. It unfolded in pulses, each wave of eruption layering on new devastation. First a warming spike, then a brief pause, then another outpouring of lava and gas. Each surge triggered feedbacks: more carbon, more methane, more anoxia, more collapse. The extinction stretched across hundreds of thousands of years, perhaps longer, but in geological terms it was still abrupt. Entire ecosystems that had taken tens of millions of years to assemble were undone in the span of a geological heartbeat. The final tally defies comprehension. Roughly 96% of marine species vanished. Whole classes of animals disappeared outright. Trilobites, survivors of earlier extinctions, were finally gone forever. Rugose and tabulate corals, architects of ancient reefs, dissolved into extinction. On land, about 70% of vertebrate species perished. The great amphibians were decimated. Most synapsids, the reptilian ancestors of mammals, vanished. Insects, the ever-present background of terrestrial life, lost lineages permanently. The Permian-Triassic extinction was not just a thinning of diversity, it was a collapse so thorough that the Earth came closer to sterilization than at any other time in its history. The aftermath must have been eerie. Imagine a coastline where waves lap against rocks but no shells litter the beach. The forests are gone, the rivers run murky with ash, and the skies hang with haze. The few animals that survive skulk at the margins, small reptiles burrowing into the soil, fish clinging to brackish refuges, plants persisting as low scrubby thickets. For millions of years, biodiversity remained astonishingly low. Evolution, usually so quick to fill an empty niche, stumbled. The world was too unstable, the climate too volatile, the ecosystems too fragile. Where earlier extinctions had been setbacks, the Permian was a true reset, a return to near emptiness. Yet even here, life found a way. Certain synapsids, the ancestors of mammals, squeaked through in scattered populations. Archosaur reptiles, ancestors of dinosaurs and crocodiles, managed to endure. A handful of hardy fish lineages survived in the least toxic corners of the ocean. From these fragments, the Mesozoic world would eventually be rebuilt. But at the end of the Permian, this was far from obvious. To the survivors, the Earth was silent, overheated, poisoned, and empty. To call this a catastrophe is almost too light. It was the darkest hour in the history of life, a moment when Earth nearly shrugged off biology altogether. If you think of bad days, picture a Monday when 9 out of 10 creatures in the sea and 7 out of 10 on land simply failed to see Tuesday. It was not merely a bad day, it was the very definition of calamity. A very bad Monday indeed. Out of the near silence that followed the Great Dying, life clawed back. For millions of years, recovery was hesitant, fragile, and easily undone, but the survivors slowly repopulated the Earth. By the middle of the Triassic period, some 240 million years ago, the planet looked less like a wasteland and more like a functioning biosphere again. Forests of conifers, cycads, and ginkgos spread across Pangaea, the vast supercontinent that dominated the globe. Ferns carpeted the understory, while horsetails and seed ferns filled the gaps. Rivers and lakes cut through the land, lined with vegetation that hinted at stability after so much collapse. The air was drier than in the carboniferous swamps, less choked with rot and humidity, but it still carried the smell of resin from conifers and the faint, constant smoke of wildfires. Animals took advantage of this new world. Amphibians, though much diminished from their carboniferous prime, still held sway in certain habitats. Some grew to grotesque sizes. Metoposaurs, amphibians that stretched more than 3 meters, sprawled in rivers like flat-bodied crocodiles, their eyes bulging above the surface as they waited for prey. In floodplains, mastodon, Orus lumbered through marshes, huge amphibians with gaping maws. These giants looked formidable, but they were relics of an earlier age, hanging on by exploiting the aquatic margins where reptiles had not yet pushed them out. Reptiles, by contrast, were everywhere. Archosaurs, the group that would later produce crocodiles, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs, proliferated in countless forms. Some were small, fast, and insectivorous, scampering across dry plains. Others grew larger, sharp-toothed hunters stalking through forests, pig-snouted dicynodonts rooted for vegetation, their tusks glinting as they tore up ferns. Etosaurs, broad-bodied, armor-plated pseudoseuchians, lumbered like prehistoric cattle. Each of these creatures reflected an experiment in survival strategies, with no clear indication yet who would dominate. Mammals had arrived too, though in forms most people today would not recognise. They were tiny nocturnal insect eaters, more shrew than anything else. Their strategy was stealth and obscurity. By burrowing, hiding and scurrying at night, they avoided the notice of the larger predators. To stand in a Triassic forest at dusk would have been to hear their faint rustling beneath the ferns, an almost invisible undercurrent of survival beneath the showier reptiles and amphibians. Dinosaurs, meanwhile, were not yet kings. The first of their kind appeared in the Middle Triassic, small and lightly built, some barely a metre tall. They ran on two legs, their arms reduced to grasping forelimbs, their jaws lined with sharp, simple teeth. They were opportunists, quick, agile, and generalist in diet. But they were overshadowed by larger, stronger reptiles and amphibians. If you had been a gambler surveying the Triassic menagerie, you would not have placed your bet on the wiry little dinosaurs. They looked like side characters in the drama of the age, not its future rulers. The stage on which these creatures lived was dramatic in itself. Pangaea sprawled across much of the globe, stretching nearly from pole to pole. Its sheer size created extremes of climate. Deep in its interior, summers were brutally hot, winters bitterly cold, and rainfall scarce. Deserts larger than modern ones stretched across its heart, dunes rolling to the horizon. Along the coasts, monsoons brought seasonal floods and torrential rains, feeding forests and rivers. Rift valleys began to open in what would one day become the Atlantic, long gashes in the crust that foreshadowed continental breakup. Standing on such a rift plain, you would have seen great escarpments rising on either side, streams cutting down into widening cracks, and faint whiffs of volcanic gases escaping from fissures. For much of the Triassic, life endured these extremes. Ecosystems adapted to seasonal stresses. Plants evolved deep roots. Animals evolved tolerance to drought. Predators developed wide ranges. But stability is never permanent. Around 201 million years ago, the rifting accelerated into catastrophe. From the cracks of Pangaea spilled fountains of lava, not from single peaks but from fissures stretching for hundreds of kilometres. The Central Atlantic magmatic province erupted, one of the greatest volcanic outpourings in Earth's history. Lava sheets poured across landscapes, turning valleys into black basalt plains. The ground itself glowed with molten rock, and the skies darkened with smoke and ash. The real devastation, as always, came from the gases. Carbon dioxide flooded the air, raising global temperatures. Methane was released from destabilized reservoirs, amplifying the heat. Sulfur dioxide created acid rain, which stripped forests and poisoned lakes. The oceans absorbed vast amounts of carbon, turning acidic and corrosive to shells. Circulation faltered, oxygen disappeared, and anoxia spread like a suffocating blanket. Hydrogen sulfide may have bubbled up from stagnant seas, drifting inland in toxic clouds. Imagine walking through a Triassic forest, the air heavy and sour, the ground blackened by acid rain, the rivers choked with algae, the horizon flickering orange from distant lava flows. Amphibians, the lumbering survivors of ancient swamps, had no chance. Their eggs and skin were too vulnerable to acid rain. Their dependence on fresh water too absolute. They vanished in wave after wave. Many reptilian lineages fell too, unable to cope with the sudden climatic oscillations. Even plants suffered steep losses, their forests dying back under the combined stress of heat, acid, and unstable rainfall. Insects lost diversity, though they would recover. On land and sea alike, the extinction rolled forward, a cleansing fire of instability. Through it all, the dinosaurs endured. Their success was not preordained, nor was it due to being stronger or smarter than their rivals. It was luck married to adaptability. They could eat plants or animals, They grew quickly, and they were efficient walkers, able to travel long distances in search of food and water. They laid many eggs, ensuring that even if catastrophe wiped out some clutches, others might survive. They were, in short, generalists, in a time when specialists perished. By the end of the extinction pulses, they were still standing. And more importantly, they were standing in a world where many of their competitors were gone. The aftermath was a quiet kind of revolution. Forests regrew, but now dinosaurs were the primary herbivores browsing them. Plains filled with herds of early sauropods, long-necked giants that rose above the tree line to strip branches. Other lineages specialized as armored herbivores, their backs bristling with bony plates. Theropods diversified into predators, from small hunters chasing mammals to larger forms experimenting with the role of apex predator. In less than 10 million years, dinosaurs had filled nearly every terrestrial niche. What had been a side character at the start of the Triassic had become the dominant force of the Jurassic. The oceans, too, reshaped themselves. Ammonites, though battered, rebounded spectacularly, swirling once again in spiral abundance. Marine reptiles, ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs, expanded into dominance, patrolling seas where amphibians and older lineages had once ruled. Coral reefs, though temporarily diminished, returned in new forms. The marine world, like the land, was simplified but stable, its survivors quick to take over abandoned roles. The Triassic-Jurassic extinction was not as severe as the Great Dying, but it was decisive. Perhaps half of all species were lost, a number sufficient to clear away the incumbents and allow new rulers to emerge. Amphibians, once titans of rivers and lakes, were reduced to small marginal survivors. Many reptile families disappeared entirely. Mammals clung to obscurity, waiting their turn in the distant future. And dinosaurs expanded into every opening, transforming from bit players into masters of the stage. If mass extinctions have a lesson, it is that power in nature is temporary and often decided by absence rather than victory. Dinosaurs did not conquer their world so much as inherit it. Their rivals fell, and the throne was left vacant. As one might put it with dry understatement, mass extinction. Nature's most brutal form of management restructuring. And so the Jurassic dawned with dinosaurs firmly in control. For the next 135 million years, they would rise to extraordinary heights of size, diversity, and spectacle. They would dominate every continent, from steaming equatorial jungles to polar forests. They would even take to the skies through their avian kin. Their reign seemed secure, their permanence unquestioned. For over 135 million years, dinosaurs thrived. From the dawn of the Jurassic through the long sweep of the Cretaceous, they had ruled the land with astonishing variety. Sauropods stretched their necks like living cranes to strip foliage from the highest branches. Ceratopsians paraded across floodplains with horned faces and frilled skulls, clashing with rivals or deterring predators. Hadrosaurs, the so-called duck-billed dinosaurs, travelled in herds, their strange crests resonating in calls that must have echoed across the plains. Raptors are thought to have hunted in packs, fast and clever, while tyrannosaurs perfected the art of sheer brute force. To live in the Cretaceous was to live in a world dominated by dinosaurs, in numbers and in scale that left no doubt as to who owned the surface of the earth. The skies were no less remarkable. Pterosaurs, masters of flight for over 100 million years, soared across coastlines, some as small as sparrows, others with wingspans rivaling small planes. Their beaks scooped fish from the surf, their wings casting long shadows over beaches crowded with turtles and crocodilians. Birds, true birds, descended from small theropod dinosaurs, also took wing, though they were still finding their place alongside their reptilian cousins. In the air, it was a competition of flapping wings, leathery or feathered, a noisy contest of flight that had been ongoing for tens of millions of years. Beneath the waves, predators no less fearsome prowled. Mosasaurs, immense marine reptiles with muscular tails and double-hinged jaws, hunted ammonites, fish, and even each other in seas that stretched across much of the continents. Plesiosaurs glided with their long necks and paddle-like flippers, while sharks darted through shoals of fish, already recognizable in form, if not in species. Ammonites, coiled mollusks related to squid and octopuses, spiraled through the waters in glittering abundance. Coral reefs teemed with life, from rudimentary crabs to filter-feeding bivalves. The oceans of the Cretaceous were busy, noisy, and dangerous, not a place for the timid. The earth itself was warm, humid, and lush. Continents had drifted close to their modern configurations, though different enough to be alien. North America was split by an inland sea, the Western Interior Seaway, stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic Ocean. Its shores were alive with crocodilians basking on mudflats, herds of hadrosaurs tramping down reeds, and pterosaurs circling overhead to dive for fish. Europe was a scattering of islands, jungled and tropical, where dwarf dinosaurs browsed beneath cycads. South America was a land of titanosaur giants and predatory abelisaurs. Asia hosted armoured ankylosaurs and swift oviraptorosaurs. Africa held spinosaurids wading in rivers, fishing with crocodile-like snouts. Forests of flowering plants, newly evolved and explosively successful, spread across the land. Their blossoms attracted insects, and their fruits provided food for many creatures. The Cretaceous was not only the age of dinosaurs, it was also the age when ecosystems began to resemble the outlines of those we recognise today. To walk through a Cretaceous plain would have been to be overwhelmed by sound and movement. The low rumble of hadrosaur herds rolled like distant thunder. The trumpeting of ceratopsians cut through the noise, answered by the guttural roars of predators. Pterosaurs screeched above, while insects hummed in clouds near blooming plants. The air smelled of resin, dung, and the faint metallic tang of blood carried from a fresh kill. It was an ecosystem at its height, vigorous, noisy, and seemingly indestructible. For 100 million years, this balance held. Dinosaurs reigned supreme on land. Pterosaurs and birds shared the skies. Mosasaurs and plesiosaurs dominated the seas, and ammonites swirled in countless forms. It was a world that appeared stable, resilient, and permanent. And then, in a single day, permanence was shattered. 66 million years ago, a rock 6 miles wide hurtled through space on a trajectory with Earth. It had been wandering the solar system for eons, invisible, irrelevant, until its orbit crossed ours at the worst possible moment. Travelling at more than 40,000 miles per hour, it struck the shallow seas off what is now the Yucatan Peninsula. The Chicxulub impact was not simply an event. It was the punctuation mark at the end of the dinosaur story. The strike released energy equivalent to billions of nuclear bombs. The sea itself vaporized in an instant, exploding upward as the asteroid punched into the crust. Shockwaves raced outward faster than sound, levelling everything for hundreds of miles. The ground liquefied, craters collapsed, and tsunamis taller than skyscrapers surged across coastlines. A blinding flash of heat seared the atmosphere, igniting forests thousands of kilometres away. Animals on distant continents, nowhere near the impact, were burned alive in an instant, their world suddenly lit by a global firestorm. Ejecta, molten rock flung into the sky, rained down across the planet. Each fragment fell at hypersonic speed, heating the air and kindling wildfires wherever it landed. For hours after the impact, the Earth glowed with fire. Forests, plains, and grasslands ignited simultaneously. The smoke was dense enough to blot out the sun, yet the heat was intense enough to cook the upper layers of soil. For those who survived the initial blast, the world became an oven, searing and uninhabitable. In the western interior seaway, shockwaves churned the water into tsunamis that tore apart coastal ecosystems. Mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, apex predators of their domain, were hurled against reefs and drowned in turbulent waves. On land, herds of hadrosaurs were incinerated, forests of cycads became tinder, and even burrowing animals felt the ground itself shudder and split beneath them. The immediate aftermath was less a world of living ecosystems and more a landscape of ash, smoke, and silence, broken only by the crackle of flames. Then came the long night. Dust, ash, and aerosols filled the atmosphere, spreading across the globe. Sunlight dimmed, then vanished. Photosynthesis faltered. Plants withered, starved of energy. Plankton in the oceans collapsed, unable to generate food chains. Temperatures plummeted as the sun's warmth was blocked, creating a sudden global winter. The survivors of the firestorm now faced cold, hunger, and darkness. Weeks turned into months, and the darkness lingered. Acid rain fell as sulfur from vaporized rock mixed with water vapor, killing freshwater ecosystems and leaching soils. Oceans, already reeling from falling productivity, grew acidic, dissolving shells and corals. Ammonites, so abundant for so long, dwindled to nothing. Mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, and countless fish starved as food webs collapsed from the bottom up. On land, herbivorous dinosaurs died first, their food sources gone. Carnivores followed, unable to sustain themselves without prey. The collapse unfolded with brutal efficiency. Within decades, ecosystems that had flourished for millions of years were gone. Roughly 3/4 of all species disappeared, including every non-avian dinosaur. Mosasaurs and plesiosaurs perished. Ammonites, after 300 million years of success, were erased. Pterosaurs, once lords of the skies, vanished entirely. The planet that had belonged to giants was suddenly left to the small, the adaptable, and the lucky. Those who endured did so not by grandeur, but by obscurity. Small mammals, many no bigger than a rat, burrowed underground, sheltering from fire and cold. In their tunnels they could store food, conserve heat, and outlast the worst of the disaster. Birds descended from small feathered theropods found ways to scavenge seeds and insects, exploiting niches where others could not. Crocodilians survived by slipping into water, capable of fasting for months when prey was scarce. Insects, resilient as always, exploited the debris, feeding on carcasses and detritus. It was not beauty or strength that saved these creatures, but flexibility. If you were smaller than a beagle and could eat anything, congratulations, you inherited the earth. The recovery was slow as it always is. Forests regrew only gradually, reclaiming ash-choked soils. Rivers cut through charred floodplains, carrying nutrients back into the seas. Plankton populations re-established themselves, and with them, the marine food chain slowly restitched. Mammals diversified in the absence of dinosaurs, first tentatively, then explosively. Birds spread across continents, adapting to roles once held by pterosaurs. Crocodiles resumed their ancient patience in rivers and lakes. Within a few million years, ecosystems were stable again, though forever altered. The age of dinosaurs had ended. The age of mammals had begun. Extinction is often imagined as a final act, an annihilation, but in the story of Earth, extinction has rarely been an ending. It has been a reset button, pressed with grim regularity, wiping the slate clean for whoever happened to remain. Each of the 5 great catastrophes was less a full stop than an ellipsis. Life paused, stuttered, diminished, and then staggered back onto its feet in some new shape. The Ordovician left the seas stripped, but brachiopods and corals returned. The Devonian drowned in green, but fish and forests came back in altered form. The Permian scoured the earth to its bones, but reptiles and synapsids endured. The Triassic culled amphibians and left dinosaurs to rise. The Cretaceous snuffed out giants, and the age of mammals began. Catastrophe does not destroy life so much as reshuffle it. There is perhaps a cruel comfort in this. Life has always been fragile, always one bad day away from collapse, but it has also been persistent beyond reason. To look at the fossil record is to see a litany of failure, but it is also to see stubbornness. Lineages cling on in the margins, adapting, shrinking, burrowing, scavenging, and waiting until the silence clears. The history of Earth is not the history of triumphal progress, but of desperate improvisation. The survivors are not the strongest, nor the largest, nor the cleverest, but those who happen to fit into the gaps catastrophe left behind. Strength, as humans tend to define it, has rarely been the deciding factor. Trilobites, armoured for defence, perish despite their resilience. Placoderms, fearsome with plated jaws, vanished when seas soured. Gorgonopsids, apex predators of the Permian, breathed their last in poisoned air. Dinosaurs, magnificent in scale, could not survive a rock from space. Meanwhile, shrews endured, turtles outlasted tyrannosaurs, and crocodiles watched kings fall and simply slid back into the water. Adaptability was always the better wager than strength, and luck was the best advantage of all. The lesson is written into the rock record, and it is not subtle. No species, no matter how successful, is immune. Diversity builds complexity. Complexity builds stability, but even the most intricate systems can collapse under pressure. The reef worlds of the Devonian seemed eternal. They dissolved in stagnation. The forests of the Permian looked indomitable. They burned and withered. The dinosaurs filled every niche for over 100 million years, only to be undone in the space of hours. Permanence is an illusion, a story we tell ourselves because it feels safer than admitting how temporary all of this really is. These endings were also beginnings. Each extinction cleared space for something unexpected. Without the Ordovician collapse, corals and fish might not have diversified as they did. Without the Devonian die-offs, tetrapods might never have found their foothold on land. Without the Permian apocalypse, the ancestors of dinosaurs and mammals might never have inherited the Earth. Without the Triassic cull, dinosaurs might have remained a minor branch, never rising to dominance. Without the asteroid, mammals would still be furtive, nocturnal scavengers instead of the inheritors of continents. Mass extinction is not only an eraser, but also a pen. It writes new stories on the cleared page, stories no one could have predicted. This is not to say those stories are kinder. Recovery is slow, measured in millions of years. For the creatures alive during collapse, there is no comfort in knowing some distant descendant will one day flourish. The trilobite dying in oxygen-starved seas was not reassured by the thought of Jurassic ammonites. The ceratopsian falling in firestorms was not comforted by the knowledge that birds would endure. Extinction is merciless at the individual level, even if the planet as a whole lurches onward. From the perspective of the Earth, species are replaceable. From the perspective of the species, annihilation is absolute. If humans are tempted to see themselves as the exceptions, the fossil record offers a gentle correction. We are a late arrival, a blink at the end of a very long film, seated in the theatre, just in time to catch the credits rolling. Our story so far has been brief compared to the reigns of others. Trilobites lasted 270 million years. Dinosaurs held the stage for over 135 million. mammals have barely had 66 million in the spotlight, and humans have existed for only a fraction of that. From a geological perspective, we are not protagonists, but cameos. Still, it is tempting to measure permanence by scale of impact rather than by span of time. Humans, in our short tenure, have reshaped the planet in ways no lineage has done before. We have cut down forests, redirected rivers, split atoms, and littered orbits with satellites. Yet to the rock record, these achievements will mean little. The Earth has burned, frozen, and poisoned itself before. It can do so again without our help. If anything, our hubris only hastens the schedule. We may think ourselves masters of extinction, but in truth, we are only participants, bound by the same fragility that doomed trilobites and tyrannosaurs. If history offers a grim reassurance, it is that life itself will almost certainly persist. It always has. Even at the nadir of the Great Dying, when 96% of species perished, a stubborn remnant survived. When firestorms ended the Cretaceous, mammals squeaked through in burrows, and birds clung to seeds. Even if humans vanished tomorrow, the planet would not fall silent. The cockroaches would march on. The weeds would split concrete. Insects would find new food sources. Given time, new lineages would rise and the story would continue. It would not be our story, but it would be a story nonetheless. The fragility of life, then, is also its strength. It collapses easily, but it returns persistently. It falters, but it improvises. It does not plan, but it endures. To look at the Earth's 5 great extinctions is not simply to marvel at destruction, but to marvel at survival. Out of ice ages, toxic seas, volcanic hellscapes, and firestorms, life has always clawed its way back. It has done so not with dignity, but with stubbornness, and not with certainty, but with chance. That, more than grandeur, is what defines the history of this planet. And what, finally, of us? We walk the earth as if permanence were promised, as if tomorrow will be much like today. Yet the rock record suggests otherwise. Extinction is not an outlier, it is the pattern. For every species alive, the odds of surviving indefinitely are vanishingly small. To be human is to be perched on a branch of a tree that has already been struck by lightning 5 times. The leaves flourish for a while, and then they fall. So perhaps the final reflection is not one of despair, but of perspective. We are here not because of superiority, but because of luck. The luck of mammals small enough to burrow, the luck of birds able to scavenge, the luck of lineages that happen to avoid being in the wrong place on the wrong day. We inherit the earth not by merit, but by vacancy. The lesson of every extinction is humility. Life endures, but no species does forever. And that brings us to the end of our long walk through Earth's 5 darkest hours. Moments when oceans boiled, skies choked, and continents fell silent, only for life to crawl back in smaller, stranger forms. Feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment with another forgotten corner of history you'd like explored next. If you'd like early access to more of these quiet descents into forgotten history, ad-free audio of the episodes, or just want to support the show, there's a link to the Patreon in the description. If you're listening on a podcast app, a rating or review helps more people find their way to these stories. And special thanks to the supporters who make this show possible, including our chroniclers, Andrew S. and Rich Davis. Sleep well.